Welcome to episode 10 of Real Health Radio.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey, Chris Sandel here, and welcome to the podcast. And today I've got an interview with Laura Schoenfeld. And Laura is a registered dietitian trained in integrative nutritional therapy for the management of chronic disease. She's passionate about making traditional diets healthful and accessible for all her clients. While she typically uses Ancestral or Paleo templates when making recommendations, she also recognizes the importance of individual health goals, unique genetic variations, and personal preferences in choosing a health-supporting diet and lifestyle program. And I discovered Laura a couple of years ago through Chris Kresser. I'm on Chris Kresser's mailing list, and she was doing some articles for his site. I don't know if she still does articles for his site, but that was how I became exposed to her. And then this year, because of the lovely Facebook algorithm, for some reason, she started coming up much more in my newsfeed. And I really liked the stuff that she was putting out, both her own articles, but articles of other people's that she was sharing. And about a month or maybe 2 months ago, I had a post that I put up that went viral, and it got exposed to sort of 350,000 people. And when I went back through to look at who were some of the people who'd shared that and helped to get that out, she was one of them. And I sent her an email just to say thank you so much for sharing the post and getting the word out. And we just started chatting via email, and I suggested that we have a chat via Skype. And we chatted via Skype and got on really well, and found that we have a lot of similar ideas in terms of helping clients in our philosophy. And she'd also recently done a post on adrenal fatigue. And I'm not the biggest fan of adrenal fatigue as a term, but her post really looked at why it's probably not the greatest term, but why it is a condition, even if it's not got the right name. And I just really liked the post, and I would hope to do a podcast on adrenal fatigue anyway, so I thought, why not invite her on to do the show? So a lot of today's show, we talk about adrenal fatigue and what it is, what it isn't, how it affects people. We also cover the paleo diet and the ancestral movement, and this is something I'm not really the biggest fan of, or not normally the biggest fan of, but we talk about her approach and how she doesn't really fit into the norms of what's typically promoted under this banner and this movement. And how she works with clients. So it's a really great chat. I really enjoyed putting this show together, and we had some really good conversations. So I hope you enjoy it. So Laura, welcome to the show. It's fantastic to have you joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So to start off with, why don't you tell people about your background, how you got into the whole health and nutrition field?
Sure. Well, from an educational perspective, I have a master's in public health, and I'm a registered dietitian. I got my degree at UNC Chapel Hill, graduated in the end of 2013, and have been doing my own private practice for about a little over a year and a half now. And then as far as how I got into nutrition in the first place, I was raised by parents, well, I should really say my mom, who is also actually a dietitian. She's only been a dietitian for maybe 10 years at this point, but she was always super interested in nutrition, and I don't even know how she got into the whole ancestral health, Weston Price kind of stuff when we were growing up, but I just remember one time, I think I was like 12 years old or something, I got home from school and I went into the fridge to get something to eat or to drink or whatever, and I saw this gallon of milk that was just like horrifying. It was super yellow tinted and had this like 3-inch thick cream top, and I was just like, what is this stuff? And then so we found out that my mom had switched us over to raw milk. And it was funny because my siblings and I think did like a little mini protest for a couple weeks about the milk and saying that we wouldn't drink it. We thought it was disgusting. And I don't really know what the transition was, but eventually we just started drinking it, and then I actually started liking it. And then now that that's really the only fluid milk I would ever drink if I am going to drink milk, just because normal grocery store milk to me doesn't taste good and it doesn't work well with my digestion. So that was like a funny story about how, as a kid, at first, things that we were doing was weird to me, and then it just became normal. And then when I got to college, things that were normal for me were really, really weird for other people. I remember I used to have roommates that would comment on the food that I was eating. They would say that, me cooking eggs in coconut oil in the morning was it smelled like vomit, so they thought it was disgusting. And then they'd see me putting salt on my food because I was an athlete and I did a lot of exercise. I sweat a lot too, so my doctor had told me to salt my food a little extra to deal with some low blood pressure issues. And every time I'd be at dinner with some friends and I'd be putting salt on my food, they'd all be like, "What are you doing? You're gonna get heart disease, and you're gonna get high blood pressure, and salt's so bad for you." And I was just like amazed how, first of all, people knew so little about nutrition and about, bioindividuality and about the difference between healthy whole foods and the kind of foods that most of my friends were eating. I always remember this one person I lived with eating rice cakes with American cheese microwaved on it. And I don't know if you guys have our equivalent of American cheese or if you know what that is, but it's basically like a piece of cheese flavored plastic, essentially. So it was just funny and weird to me that there was so much, distorted understanding of nutrition and what kind of food is good to eat amongst my peers. And so I just started getting way more interested in talking to people about it. And eventually I lived in Australia for a year, and I know you haven't lived there in a while, but I found that Australians, at least in the Sydney, Bondi area, were so much more into the whole healthy, ancestral health, paleo, all that stuff, kind of a little bit of an alternative nutrition philosophy. Yeah. And so I started getting exposed to a lot of that information while I was in Australia. And it was at that point when I was living down there that once I realized how often I was talking about it and how much people were interested in hearing about it, that I was like, oh, this actually might be something I'd like to do as a career. So when I got home, I went to grad school, and it's kind of just been an upward spiral from there as far as my involvement and the kind of work that I do, and started working for a guy named Chris Sandel, which some of your listeners may be familiar with. So it's just been kind of a interesting journey from the point where, a lot of, I ate a certain way, but I didn't really think about it a lot. And then I kind of went through this phase of being very conscious about it and, being kind of paleo bandwagon. And then now I'm at the point where I'm questioning a lot more of the stuff that I was exposed to in the last, 5 or 10 years. So it's kind of like a constant evolution of my beliefs, and I try to be as as open-minded as possible while still not allowing myself to get too sucked into all the different theories that are out there, since, as you know, there's a lot of different perspectives, and most of the time it's really hard to know if they're actually accurate, since the science isn't necessarily caught up with the theory.
Yeah, and I would definitely say that I know, if I look back over the 10 or so years that I've been doing this, there is definite times where I go through my such and such phase, and I go through that phase, and that's just a natural progression I think most people go through as they go through being a nutritionist and being exposed to different clients and what's working and what's not. And I don't think you can get to that place really without seeing clients and without having that exposure to what works for other people, as opposed to just thinking about, well, what works for me must work for everyone else.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that's been somewhat of a challenge, just because, as you, I'm sure, know, you can have one patient with a certain health situation that gets a great result from one approach, but then another patient who's got a very similar health situation may not get that result. And then you have to decide, okay, is it that the diet's not right? Are they not adhering to the diet? Is it there's just so many factors that can play in. And then, of course, the question of whether the diet is even the issue, because, as we know, there's so many other factors that can play into health. So it's kind of amazingly complicated. I gave a little question and answer session at a library for free. This actually was just yesterday. And it was funny because I was getting all these questions that basically every time I answered, I had to be like, well, sometimes it's like this, and then sometimes it's like that. And it's, and at the end I was just like, I don't want you guys to think that this is like some insanely complicated issue that is just going to drive you crazy. I don't want you to come out of here thinking that you have to have a PhD in nutrition to understand what your personal health is. and how to eat in a way that supports your health. So, there's a fine line between something being complicated enough and not overly simplifying nutrition into something that's just like, eat this and not that, and then you'll be healthy. But then on the flip side, I try not to get so complicated that people just feel completely overwhelmed. So, as you said, having experience with clients really helps refine that approach, especially because everyone's different. You'll have some people that are like, just doing a gluten-free diet would be, really challenging for them. But then you have other clients where they've basically removed so many foods that they're hardly eating anything anymore. So it is interesting, and it's been a big learning process for me in the last year and a half.
Yeah. And just going back to your comments about being at the library yesterday and doing that Q&A, I find whenever I do sessions like that, I end up saying, well, it depends. And it's just the constant comment that I have to say, because it really does depend on the individual. And there are so many factors that can come into it. And I've very much over the years, so much of what I used to believe was so true and I was so adamant about, I'm now not believing what I did before and going in the opposite direction, or it's on very shaky ground. Right. And so it then just becomes much more about, well, we have to see, and it depends on the situation. And with these are the other variables, then maybe so. And if they're not, then maybe this is the way you want to look at it. And there just isn't any black and white answers, unfortunately, which is very maddening. I feel for the general public who are trying to be healthy. Right. Because it's so difficult, because everything you read is contradictory.
And unfortunately, it's really hard to market that kind of answer, because, and I'm not saying, that you should do something based on its marketing ability, but as I'm sure the strategies that get super popular are obviously easily marketed. Yeah. And so you get this kind of like one size fits all recommendation that maybe works for, let's just even say 50% of the people that try it. And then you get the other 50% of the people that either give up because it's not working, which is a good thing probably. But then you get, some people that just keep trying and think there's something wrong with them if it's not working. I mean, this one woman asked me yesterday about multivitamins, and I started going into all these different reasons why various issues can come up with multis, and you have to be really careful. And she said, oh, well, I just read this book that said that, all these different things are wrong with multis. And they said that the only multi that's good is the one that they sell. And I'm like, sounds about right. It's like, I guess if I was writing a book about about micronutrients and had a multivitamin to sell, I'd probably say that as well. But actually, I shouldn't say I would, because I would never do that. So,
yeah. No. So, one of the big reasons I wanted to have you on the show today is to discuss the topic of adrenal fatigue. And when I was putting together this podcast show, and I think we're up to show 9 or 10. I'll remember when I'm recording the intro later on. But I wrote in notes, which topics did I want to cover, and a lot of the shows I'll do on my own, and others I'll have guests. And one of the topics I wanted to do was adrenal fatigue, and is it real, and what's it all about. And it was a topic I was going to do on my own. And then I recently saw you wrote an article about it. You covered a lot of the stuff I was going to cover. So I thought I got in contact with you and invited you to come on the show. So for anyone who's listening and has no idea about adrenal fatigue or what is it, or never have heard the term, do you want to give a sort of layperson's explanation about what adrenal fatigue is?
Yeah, so what I think is really important, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening have at least heard the term before. What's really important to know about the term adrenal fatigue is that it's not really an accurate description for what's going on inside the body. And, there's a lot of arguments out there about it not existing, and about the word adrenal fatigue being completely misinterpreting the issues that happen with adrenal function, which I actually agree with. So for someone that has a program on adrenal fatigue, you would think I would be adamantly opposed to what everyone is saying about adrenal fatigue not existing. I think that it's actually accurate to say that adrenal fatigue is not a good term and it shouldn't really be used. But basically, adrenal fatigue is the lay person's term for something called HPA axis dysregulation. So HPA stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. And basically, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is the control center for your body's stress response. So when you get stressed from anything, whether that's, a traffic jam in the morning or having a fight with a spouse or, even something as serious as the death of a loved one, your body is going to have a stress response it should be relatively appropriate to the level of the stressor. So when you get stressed, the concentrations of the hormones that the HPA axis produces are increased. So one of the hormones that a lot of people hear about is something called cortisol. And the way that this system works is that the hypothalamus, which is in your brain, releases something called corticotropin-releasing hormone. And that's the first hormone that's in a cascade of hormonal changes that eventually results in the production of cortisol, which is the quote-unquote stress hormone. And that comes from the adrenal glands. And then elevated cortisol levels are, they have a lot of different functions in the body, but one of the main functions is to direct the distribution of energy to different organs. So basically, if you're in a stress response, our body may perceive that as something where, you have to do that fight or flight response where you're going to want a lot of the energy going to your brain, to your heart, to your muscles so that you can either run away or fight if necessary. And this is a totally normal response. And it's something that your body was designed to do. So, there's nothing unhealthy about having a cortisol reaction to a stressor. Now, the HPA axis does have a few different feedback loops that help the body to normalize the production of cortisol. So you obviously don't want to have high cortisol all the time. You want to have it when you're stressed, and then it should go back down to normal when you're not stressed. And this prevents your body from becoming overstimulated by those stressors that are more chronic in nature. So maybe you are always in a traffic jam when you drive to work. You wouldn't want your body having a major cortisol response every single morning if, you're constantly exposed to that stressor. So this process is called habituation, and it's just basically a process where the body is able to decrease its activation of, the different stress hormones when you're exposed to stress. And you also can call this adaptation. So again, totally normal, totally healthy. And this is able to help prevent any negative side effects of chronic HPA activation. But unfortunately, certain people are not able to adapt appropriately to the daily stress that they're facing. And that's especially if the stress is a lot more significant than something like a traffic jam on their way to work. So, there are some people that have some significant stressors like an abusive relationship, or maybe they have a sick family member that they're caring for. Perhaps they have a handful of very young children that they're not sleeping a lot and they have to take care of children on their own. Maybe they're going through some serious financial strain. One of the more common chronic stressors that I see in my clients is overtraining and undereating. So even though that might not seem like an emotional stressor, that's something to me that is, a similar level of chronic stress from a physical perspective. So when the HPA axis isn't able to adapt to these daily chronic stressors appropriately, this is where the symptoms of adrenal fatigue syndrome start to become an issue. So usually what happens is we'll end up having high cortisol to start. So if you're just constantly activating the HPA axis with lots of different stressors, then you just are having a chronically elevated cortisol level. And then what will happen as the HPA axis tries to adapt to that stressors is that your cortisol level will start to drop, and then it can become low cortisol. Now, there is some evidence that certain traumatic and stressful events can actually send the HPA axis straight into low cortisol output, but other situations can be that people have a reversal of their cortisol output because of circadian rhythm dysfunction, which is just related to mostly light and dark signaling, but sleep and daily life patterns in general. So ultimately, the adrenals are not actually getting fatigued, and this is where a lot of people kind of base their argument from that adrenal fatigue doesn't exist. So your adrenal glands are in adrenal fatigue, they're perfectly functional. Now, that doesn't mean that adrenal glands can't be damaged or dysfunctional. If they aren't working, that's something called Addison's disease. So, the adrenals can actually become non-functional in certain conditions. But for the average person that's dealing with adrenal fatigue syndrome, their adrenals are perfectly healthy and able to produce the cortisol that they need to produce. However, the brain and the hypothalamus is not stimulating them appropriately anymore. So that's kind of I don't know if that's a short answer, but that's kind of a summary of what happens with adrenal fatigue. So just to kind of recap in a very basic way, essentially you're exposed to stress, either very significant acute stress or long-term chronic stress on a daily basis or a regular basis. And instead of being able to respond appropriately to those stressors with an influx of cortisol or a drop in cortisol appropriately, your brain starts to shut down the production of cortisol because it's just not able to deal with the amount and duration of the stress that you're exposed to. So essentially, adrenal fatigue is really more of a brain issue than an adrenal issue. So, it is an unfortunate term, and I don't love it when I hear people talking about, I have to support my adrenals and I have to heal my adrenals. I don't love that terminology, just because, again, it really is more of a brain issue than an adrenal issue. But ultimately, this is what causes all those symptoms that people talk about when they talk about adrenal fatigue syndrome.
Right. And I mean, personally, I'm not a big fan of the term adrenal fatigue for some of the reasons you said there. When I talk about stress, and I talk about this a lot with clients, I really talk about the stress response as being pretty much energy regulation within the body, and that your body has to turn on stress hormones when you've run out of the meal that you've just eaten, when you're running out of glycogen, which is an energy source that you can use between meals and in times of stress. And that when people are finding themselves in adrenal fatigue, in inverted commas, it's because they're not matching up their diet and lifestyle to the demands that are then being placed on their body. And from my perspective, it's not so much about the adrenals, which is where I think way too many people focus. And it's this, we need to fix your adrenals, we need to give you these supplements, these herbs to heal your adrenals, without looking at, what the hell's going on with your whole entire life that is then putting you into this state. Exactly. And what could we be doing to then support the body so it can heal itself and get out of this state?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, I think with the typical adrenal fatigue supplements that are sold, what I find with my clients and our students in my adrenal fatigue program is that a lot of times those supplements can take the edge off of some of the symptoms. So, if somebody's just really working very hard on fixing their lifestyle, but they just have these, physical symptoms that are disruptive to them, sometimes the supplements can help take a little of the edge off of that to make the process of healing a little bit more comfortable. But like you said, there's no way that I would ever suggest to somebody that they just take adrenal fatigue supplements and that's enough to deal with the issue. So ultimately, it's the same as taking a medication for something. I don't know, for example, taking a statin for high cholesterol instead of addressing the diet and lifestyle factors that can cause high cholesterol. So in that same sense, you wouldn't want to just take a supplement that's supposed to support your adrenals when you are perhaps undereating, overexercising, not sleeping well, super stressed at work, having poor relationships. So, there's a lot of different things that can be perceived as stress to your body. And I think, unfortunately, our modern society has a lot of these issues that, cause stress to the body, whether that's, chronic dieting or using your iPad or phone at 11 o'clock at night and not going to bed on time, that kind of stuff. So, dealing with adrenal fatigue is always going to be a holistic approach to the entire lifestyle and the diet. And the adrenal supplements are one of those things that, may or may not even help the person start to feel better in the short term, and certainly would never be a long-term strategy for healing.
Yeah, because I find too many people, it's like the supplements are the whole strategy. and that there isn't enough of a focus on all the other areas. And yes, they can help people, but they give you that tiny little bit extra. And if you're not dealing with the rest of that stuff, then it's going to do very little. And just something else that you just said there in terms of stress, so much of what is stressful to the body, people don't even think about as being stress. It's normally that when people think of the term stress, it is there's a death in the family, there's the mortgage I can't pay, like these really obvious stressors. But from my perspective, what really grinds people down and what really is poor for them are things that they wouldn't even identify as stressful in terms of not eating enough calories, going too long between meals, doing lots of exercise and then not eating to support that. And really re-educating people on what stress really means within the body is really part of helping with this issue.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, that the word stress, I think most people think of emotional stress as being the issue, but really stress is kind of a interesting term, because I think in the scientific definition, it's really just, it's not even necessarily something that's negative. Obviously, there can be positive stressors. For example, exercise in general is a positive stressor. It kind of breaks down your muscles a little bit, puts a little stress on your bones, but then your body responds in a way to strengthen those parts of your, your bones and your muscles get stronger in response to that stress. So a little bit of stress and a little bit of physical stress is not a bad thing, but it's when that stress becomes excessive or just constant. The whole over-exercising thing is super common in the paleo community. I see lots of, especially women, but men also, that are doing way too much exercise for the kind of lifestyle that they have. And, I've heard some people argue that overtraining in a non-professional athlete is not a real thing, which I think they're talking about the amount of training volume is not something that should be considered overtraining. But on the flip side, what I would actually say is mostly happening is under recovery. So, under eating, which, you do need that fuel to rebuild the body after going through the stress of exercise. Things like under sleeping and, just generally, if you're having other sources of stress in your life and then you're adding on top of that a high level of physical exercise stress, then it's really just the sum total of all the different stresses in your life that can lead to this HPA axis dysregulation.
Yeah. And I guess one of the ways I then explain stress to people is stress is an adaptation within the body, or the body trying to make an adaptation. And if you're then not providing it with the resources or the fuel to be able to do that, then it becomes something negative. Whereas if it's able to get what it needs, then it then makes the changes whatever they are, and then it moves on. And so everything you've described there is when people are doing stuff, but they're not giving their body enough of those adaptations.
Yeah, and it's, as opposed to the body getting stronger in response to, bursts of stress, it actually becomes weaker because it just can't respond appropriately.
Yeah. And what about saliva tests for the adrenal glands? So this is very common for people to do the saliva test. You do a test at 4 points throughout the day. You spit it into a little test tube, and then they analyze the saliva and say how much cortisol and DHEA, which is another hormone, and they test it so they can look at the different points throughout the day. How accurate do you think these things are? Do you use them very much with clients?
So I find that the saliva testing question is pretty controversial, mostly because there's a handful of practitioners and doctors that say that the tests are inaccurate, that, you can do multiple tests and get different results. And then you have other doctors that say the tests are accurate enough and they can help to, craft the treatment plan in response to what's going on. One of the examples there is that if somebody has high versus low cortisol output, you don't want to be giving them things that make so I'll say, okay, if somebody has high cortisol, you don't want to be giving them an herb that actually causes cortisol to last longer in the body. So an example of that is licorice. So, when it comes to cortisol testing, I don't know if saliva testing is 100% accurate. I personally feel that the testing is not essential to the treatment, especially because really the only thing I believe that it affects is the if you're going to be using any sort of herbal protocol. So if you don't actually involve any sort of herbal or adaptogenic protocol as part of the treatment, then knowing what the saliva test says or knowing what the actual cortisol pattern is not really going to change all the other stuff that we focus on, all those lifestyle factors that are a problem for most people that are dealing with adrenal fatigue syndrome. One thing I will say is that I have recommended the test to certain clients, and I think most of the ones that I've recommended it to are the ones that really need something on paper that will show them that their lifestyle is having a negative impact. So an example of that is someone who is doing CrossFit 5 or 6 days a week and on a low carb diet and, maybe has a stressful job and, is trying to sleep, maybe isn't sleeping well because of the types of symptoms they get from this issue. And they just, for whatever reason, it's not sinking in that is the issue that is causing all their symptoms. They want to do food sensitivity testing, or they want to, eliminate certain parts of their diet because they're like, oh, well, maybe eggs are causing me to feel fatigued or something, that kind of like anything but my hobbies or, that kind of situation. Yeah. So, I've recommended it a handful of times to people who were really resistant to the idea of changing their lifestyle. And again, that's more of a situation where if they see a result that shows their cortisol rhythm totally flatlined, I think they are able to acknowledge that their lifestyle is an issue at that point. So again, I don't typically recommend the testing to 90% of my clients with what appears to be adrenal fatigue syndrome. I may do it if somebody wants to do supplements. So part of our program is offering the saliva test if that's something that the person wants to do. And we tell them that they shouldn't be using any of the herbs unless they've tested the cortisol. Because again, I don't want somebody taking a supplement that's going to raise their cortisol if they already have high cortisol or vice versa. But then the other handful of people are the ones that really just need some type of quote unquote concrete evidence that their lifestyle is an issue. And, a handful of my clients have finally made the changes that they needed to make because they saw that paper that said that their adrenal function was basically in the toilet. So that might not be the most scientific methodology, but a lot of times especially in nutrition where we don't have a ton of access to any sort of diagnostic testing. And a lot of my clients come to me because their doctors didn't want to do testing or, told them that they were fine and that they didn't have anything wrong with them. Those kind of tests that are available to us, just, sometimes they can be helpful. Sometimes they're not helpful. I'm very mindful of my clients' budget. So I don't want somebody spending $200 on something that's not really going to affect our treatment plan. So, it's a very, I'd say a controversial issue. There are some urinary tests for cortisol that most integrative physicians and naturopaths would say maybe would be more accurate than the salivary cortisol panel, but that's another one that, again, you have to go to a doctor that actually runs those tests, and I know very few doctors that do those. So it's one of those things that if somebody thinks they have adrenal fatigue, I'm not going to say, go get tested and figure it out, but, if they need that test to really motivate them to start making changes, then it might be something that's useful.
Yeah, and I would agree with you on that. And I used to probably 4 or 5 years ago do adrenal tests with people, and then I stopped doing them with them. But there will be occasions, it hasn't been for a while, but in a similar scenario to you, where people just aren't getting it. And they're really fighting it and thinking, no, it's not because of this, not because of that. And it's almost, I will do the test. I know what the test is going to show because of everything else I'm seeing. And then we do it, and then it's in black and white, and they can then see it. But I'd say for me personally these days, I do it less and less because I use temperature and pulse a lot with people. Mm-hmm. And I know there's going to be variations of where someone's going to be, and you can have a situation where someone is going to be having problems with their adrenal, where their temperature and pulse could be really high or it could be really low. But I can normally talk people, tell them about why I'm seeing certain patterns and how that fits into other things. So we get to the point where they understand what's going on, and they understand why they need to make those changes without us having to do the saliva test.
Yeah. And a lot of times you don't even necessarily need a diagnostic technique to note that somebody's lifestyle is not supportive of good health. So, so usually the most informative part of my intakes is the part where the patient writes down what their stress habits are, what their exercise habits are, their 24-hour food diary, that kind of stuff, honestly, is more informative to me than a saliva test.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And based on your own experience, how much do you think that undereating, whether intentionally or unintentionally, plays a role as part of this? Because from my experience, it's normally one of the biggest things.
I actually think it's almost universal. When I have somebody with adrenal fatigue syndrome, I've rarely seen a person who was eating appropriately or even overeating and dealing with adrenal dysfunction. So with undereating, there can be a variety of different reasons why that's happening. Obviously, one of the more common ones is having a weight loss goal. And, the typical recommendations for weight loss is eat less, move more. So that's, that information is driven into our heads from a very early age. And especially if somebody has a history of being overweight, I've heard of clients that they were put on a diet when they were 5 years old. So, they have a long history of either chronic dieting, cyclical dieting, weight loss and weight regain. And, they start reducing their intake either purposefully or, with a lot of women that I work with, it's almost accidentally, because they just have this idea of what a woman should eat as far as the volume is concerned. So that's one of the big ones, is when people are trying to either lose or maintain a certain weight. And then the other one that I see happening a lot, since I do work with a lot of people on the paleo diet, is that they're dealing with a secondary issue like an autoimmune disease or a gastrointestinal disease like IBS or SIBO or IBD, one of those issues. And because they are noticing improvements in those issues initially when they start cutting foods out, they end up cutting out so many foods that their overall food intake just drops to the point where it's under eating. And then that's when they start to see a lot of their symptoms return or maybe new symptoms cropping up. So, under eating isn't just an issue for people who want to lose weight. It's, one of the worst cases I ever saw. Unfortunately, she's doing much better now, but she ended up in an eating disorder facility because she was trying so hard to figure out what foods were causing her symptoms that she ended up just almost eating nothing. So, it's something that I try really hard to make sure that my clients are not overly restrictive if unnecessary. And if they do have necessary restrictions for whatever reason, we really focus on getting enough of the food that they can eat comfortably to make sure that they're not accidentally getting into this situation.
Yeah. And I hear it regularly from clients, is that even when they're drastically under eating, they're looking around and they're saying, oh, but in comparison to my coworkers or in comparison to my other girlfriends or other friends, I eat loads. And my response to that is always, you should not be looking around at what other people are doing in society as your gauge as to how much you should eat, because everyone is dieting, everyone is trying to lose weight regardless of what their size is. And if you're looking at what someone else is eating for lunch as your measure of what you should have, then you're going to undereat naturally because of that.
Yeah. Or the other issue is if people are wanting to lose weight or just think maybe even that they're at a healthy weight, they say, oh, well, if I was under eating, I would be losing weight. Just because of the, calories in, calories out principle. And what they don't understand is that the adrenals actually, so I should say the HPA axis in general highly interacts with your metabolic rate. So obviously I shouldn't say obviously, if people aren't aware, your hypothalamus and pituitary gland also control your thyroid function. So if there's a bunch of stress or, environmental signaling to your body that you're in a state of food shortage or, there's some kind of serious stressor happening, which, 500 to 1,000 years ago, that would have been something like a famine or warfare or, violence or something like that. Your body starts to downregulate all of its processes that take a lot of energy because it needs to conserve energy for running away or fighting, or if there is a famine, it doesn't want to be using all the extra energy that's there and then, starving to death at some point. So when you're under this kind of stress that is down regulating your adrenal function, it's also going to affect your thyroid function, which generally will reduce your metabolic rate. And then, what might have been a weight loss calorie intake in the past for you will then turn into a weight maintenance calorie amount. So people will say, well, I'm not losing weight, so obviously I'm not under eating. And they don't realize that the body is able to slow down the metabolism and also shut down some non-essential functions. Like, for example, fertility is one of those examples of a non-essential function that will often be one of the first things that your body stops doing to conserve energy. So, I always find that to be a very common response. And that doesn't even necessarily have to be a person that's trying to lose weight. It could be a person that's a normal weight that just assumes that if they were under eating that their weight would be going down.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. And in terms of under eating and you coming from the Paleo Ancestral community, I mean, how much do you think is also coming from people not eating enough carbohydrates? Because low carb, at least in my mind, and I'd say in a lot of people's, is synonymous with Paleo or Ancestral.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think the typical layperson's understanding of what a paleo diet should be ends up being like steak and broccoli with coconut oil on it or something like that. So maybe a lot of bacon on the side, since obviously paleo people eat a ton of bacon, which I always laugh about because honestly I can remember the last time I had bacon, but it was like a little bacon in like a potato salad. So I can't remember the last time I ate just a strip of bacon. So not that I'm saying bacon's a bad thing to eat necessarily, but it's certainly not what I would consider a health food to eat lots of every day.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry for that little tangent, but so anyway, the low carb thing, I don't even know if people in general realize that it's a low carb diet, what they're doing a lot of times with paleo, just simply because people just remove certain foods from their diet, like grains or fruit's one of those things that I still to this day do not understand why people think fruit wouldn't be counted on a paleo diet. It's, that whole sugar phobia that we've developed in the last few years in nutrition. But basically they just start eating in a way that, whether or not they do it on purpose, ends up being a very low carb diet. Now, for some people, especially people that are significantly overweight or have some type of insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, those kind of people, they are usually the ones that benefit the most from a lower carb diet, at least in the beginning. So, a lot of people will go on a short-term low carb diet as a therapeutic option for people that have poor blood sugar control, insulin resistance, all that stuff. However, a lot of people that go to a paleo diet, they're not doing it to lose 100 pounds or to deal with diabetes. They're doing it because, their CrossFit gym did a paleo challenge, and that's just what they were doing because they thought it would help their athletic performance and their body composition, that kind of thing. And so you get these people that don't need to go on a low carb diet. And for a lot of people who wouldn't benefit from a low carb diet, and athletes are one of those examples that definitely, well, I shouldn't say definitely, but the average person that's training hard and doing a lot of glycolytic activities like weight training, CrossFit, sprinting, that kind of stuff, those people are actually going to really suffer on a low carb diet. So I am not of the opinion that low carb diets are never appropriate. However, I think there's a lot of people out there that are doing them simply because either they're accidentally not eating carbs because of what they think a paleo diet looks like, or they actually are actively avoiding carbs because they've fallen into the philosophy that carbohydrates are non-essential macronutrients that your body can create all the glucose that it needs, and that, extra sugar in the body is what contributes to diseases like Alzheimer's and diabetes and cancer and all that stuff. So there's a lot of different reasons why people might be limiting or avoiding carbs purposefully or accidentally. And that's something that I work with a lot of clients on, is getting them to increase their carb consumption to a level that matches their activity and their health needs. And a lot of times that requires a level of dietary diversity that isn't a strict paleo diet. So things like gluten-free grains can really be helpful. White potatoes, which again, another food that I'm just completely confused as to why that's not considered paleo. But, if somebody wants to be strict paleo, I say fruit and potatoes and plantains. And then if they're willing to experiment with non-paleo foods, then we add in things like rice and other gluten-free grains, maybe some quinoa if they tolerate it, that kind of stuff. So long story short, low carb can be effective for certain conditions, but it's certainly not necessary or even recommended for a lot of other health situations. And unfortunately, the typical understanding of paleo is that it is a low carb diet.
Yeah. And I would say that a lot of the people who've taken up paleo, I know a lot of it is from a weight loss perspective, but a lot of it is people who are then hitting the gym pretty hard. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't think of a worse diet for someone to be on than a low carb diet when you're doing that kind of exercise.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, one of the reasons why I think it becomes such a big problem is that most people, if they've switched from a standard American or standard Western diet to a low-carb paleo diet, they usually do lose some weight pretty quickly. And as we know, and I'm not sure if your listeners know, but the majority of the weight lost in the first couple weeks of a low-carb diet is going to be water and glycogen. Yeah. So glycogen's your storage form of carbohydrates, which those get depleted on a low carb diet very quickly, especially if you're exercising. And then I don't remember the exact ratio, but I know that when glycogen is stored, for every gram of glycogen, there's like 3 or 4 grams of water stored as well. So that would mean for a pound of glycogen that your body is storing, it's going to store 3 to 4 pounds of water. So that's why they can lose 5 to 10 pounds within the first 2 or so weeks of doing a low carb diet. And if weight loss is the goal, and certainly, if you lose water and glycogen, your muscle definition will pop out a little bit more in the short term. People suddenly say, "Oh wow, this diet's amazing. This is working so well. I can't believe how much weight I just lost." And then it becomes this like self-fulfilling prophecy where they just assume that the low carb is going to help them continue to lose weight. And then when it starts to go in the opposite direction and they start gaining not only fat, but also putting on water because of the stress hormones in their body that are trying to keep their blood sugar stable while they're, doing CrossFit, they just start to wonder, like, why am I putting weight on? Why am I getting belly fat? All these questions that they don't connect it to the low carb. They think, well, the carbs helped me lose weight. So why would I add carbs back in if that's the way that I lost weight in the first place? And it really is, I do a lot of work with clients, just getting them into a moderate to higher carb diet that it takes so much of a psychological adjustment for these people because they've just determined that the low carb was the perfect diet for them. And, that is supported by a lot of the blogs out there. And then they just have to, I don't know, our program's called Paleo Rehab. And that's exactly what we try to do is we try to rehab people out of this like super strict low carb paleo approach that isn't working for them anymore. And it is such a psychological thing that, it's a really long process. And I'm sure that you do this with your clients frequently. So what it's like when clients are adding carbs back in and they start to gain a couple of pounds and they start to freak out because their goal is weight loss, and you basically have to talk them off the ledge because they're, ready to give up on the whole thing because they think it's not working or going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And look, basically everything you've described there in terms of people losing water weight and losing glycogen happens in the exact opposite direction when someone starts to put carbs back into their diet. And so in a very short space of time, you put on a fair bit of weight, and that really freaks people out. I mean, the way I get around it is I'm really upfront with people when I start working with them. And I tell people that you're going to put on weight when we start together most of the time. And I'm never one to promise people weight loss. I tell them I don't do weight loss with people, that I think if they follow my approach and they follow it long term, then yes, it could lead to weight loss. But in the 5 months we're going to work together, I'm not going to promise them that, and I can't guarantee it. And so if people start freaking out, at least I've got the, well, I told you about this to start with. So I haven't given someone all this hope about, yeah, I'm going to have you looking amazing, you're going to have abs and whatnot, and then it go in the opposite direction. So I guess that honesty to start helps. It doesn't do everything. And
right.
I find a lot of what I do with people has nothing to do with nutrition. It is me being a therapist, me getting them to understand what it means to be thin or fat or what their weight means in terms of who they are as a person, etc. And I would imagine that that's a lot of what you do as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, honestly, I feel like I need a second degree in psychology, which I actually have an undergraduate degree in psychology, but that's something that, and I know we've talked about this before, there's almost nothing that can prepare you for that kind of work except for just experience. Yeah. So it is interesting. And like you said, as much as you can warn people up front and as much as they can agree that it's worth that outcome to get feeling better and sleeping better. And, you know, I always try to remind people of all the symptoms that they're dealing with that I expect to see improved. So it's like, you know, you're not guaranteeing weight loss, and certainly you never guarantee health outcomes anyway, but you say, well, I'm pretty confident that you're going to start sleeping better, that you're potentially going to regain your menstrual cycle, that your workouts are going to start feeling better, that you're going to stop having as much anxiety. And you can like lay out all those different things that are going to improve and see those improve over the time that you're working with the person. But the whole weight thing is just, it's amazing. And I, you know, being a woman in her 20s and wanting to have a certain level of fitness and physique, I understand it. Like, I personally struggle with that stuff too, where it's like, you know, you want to do what's right for your health, but then you also, you have this sense of identity that is connected to how you look. And when your appearance starts to change in a way that you don't deem an improvement, it is difficult, and it is, you know, a little scary, and starts to make you question if what you're doing is really the right thing to do. So, you know, I think it's easy to talk about it where you're saying you need to love yourself and you need to not worry about your weight and you need to, you know, be okay with this process happening. But when you're in the trenches of it, it's like, you know, you understand that it feels really crappy to go through that stuff. And it's important to give a person support and also help them understand that this is something that is worth doing, because ultimately at the end of the day, people really put a lot of value on appearance, that, you know, our society values appearance and thinness and, or, you know, fitness. We say strong is the new skinny, but, you know, it ends up being just lean is the new skinny, essentially. And it can be really hard for people, especially women, to shake that belief that their self-worth is based on their appearance. So it's really challenging, and I don't want people to feel like we would be minimizing that struggle at all. But it is something that, like I said, I think in the long run is worth it, because I've never heard someone say that being thin or lean was worth feeling like shit on a daily basis. Excuse my French.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree. And that's the thing, when I'm working with someone and their weight is going up a little bit to start with, it's always then bringing it back to, yeah, but you're now sleeping and you've just had your period return and your digestion's getting better, etc. So it's like, yeah, there's an extra 3 or 4 pounds, but you've had all of these improvements in your symptoms. And if you had to trade between the two, what's more important to you on a daily basis? And sometimes when people are really honest, they're like, you know what, I really want to say my health, but at this stage I'm feeling that it's my weight. And then we can talk about that. But trying to, as much as possible, tie it back into, so they're looking at the bigger picture and all of the things that are connected in there, not just about that my weight's gone up. And also getting people to understand that, you know what, your weight's gone up, but when it was thinner, you weren't any happier. Like, you talk about how amazing it used to be when you were thinner, but you were miserable. You've told me you were miserable. You told me about all of these other things that were going on. So at least be honest about the situation, as opposed to looking back with rose-tinted glasses about how good it used to be.
Yeah. And I've definitely been there myself. I was quite lean in college because I was on the volleyball team practicing 6 days a week and doing, training with the football team in the morning. And I was at my leanest, I was 30 pounds lighter than I am now. And honestly, I was still like unhappy with my physique. I still felt embarrassed about not having a six pack and that kind of stuff. And it's just, ultimately, I know this is very cliche to say, but your perception of what you look like is not necessarily going to improve from weight loss. I mean, it might improve a little bit, but unless you can be okay with what you look like, no matter what your weight is, that there's always going to be this dissatisfaction that comes from your body, no matter how lean you are. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to get fitter and be a little leaner and, improve your appearance or, I don't want to say that's morally wrong to want that. But on the flip side, it's really important to understand that your happiness is not going to depend solely on your weight, and that, if that's the goal, is to become happy by getting thin, then it's a pretty, not great goal to have.
Yeah, because it's unlikely that's going to occur because things change in such a slow manner that when you then reach your goal, you'll then find something else that you want to change.
Yeah.
And so there is no point where you're like, oh, I'm here, I've arrived, I don't need to do anything else. There's always I could lose a little bit here, or I could have a bigger bust, or I could have and the list goes on.
And it's interesting. There's actually been some research that I've read about how self-image can actually affect your physique. So there is evidence that, I don't know if it's just women, but people who believe that they are fat, they've tracked them over time, and the people who believe that they're fat actually gain more weight over time than the people that don't believe that they're fat, no matter where their starting weight was. So
yeah, I saw that bit of research last week, which is really fascinating.
And I it's hard to necessarily say whether that's causative or correlative, but I do believe that there is a connection between the kind of things that you think about yourself and the way that your body ends up responding. So if you're constantly, pinching your belly or looking at your butt in the mirror and saying, oh my gosh, I'm so fat, like my butt is so big, my gut is disgusting, like just having these super negative thoughts, I would not be surprised if that actually ends up causing you to gain weight in those areas. Now, I know that's a little bit of like woo-woo, maybe not super scientific, but I do think that our thoughts can make a major change in our health. And now whether that's, from the body literally changing to support your thoughts, or if those thoughts are causing HPA axis issues, which then allows your body to start storing fat around your gut and that kind of thing. It's, chicken or the egg question. But I think self-talk during this experience of changing your diet and trying to get healthier and trying to, feed yourself in a way that's supporting your entire energy system and not just eating in a way to lose weight. I think starting with the task of at least getting rid of all of the negative things that we say to ourselves. It doesn't have to be like every day you wake up and you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm beautiful and I have a perfect body and I'm so happy with myself. Like obviously everyone struggles a little bit with self-doubt or, has days where they feel negatively about themselves, whether that's their appearance or their health or their life situation, whatever. But I think just recognizing the amount of negativity that we carry around in our minds throughout the day and trying to work on shifting that to a more positive overall mental state, I think is really important. And it's something that I don't know if a lot of people necessarily deal with that during the weight loss process. So it'll either prevent them from losing the weight that they want to lose, or they'll get to the weight that they want to be, and that negativity will just still be there and it hasn't really solved anything.
Yeah. And I focus a lot when I'm working with people on what is the internal environment that you're creating for yourself in terms of what are you saying to yourself? How do you speak to yourself? What's the tone that you use? What are the past events, future events, all of this stuff that you focus on, because that's going to largely dictate how you feel about the world. And it is really important. And even going back to what you were saying about body image and people waking up and saying how beautiful they are, etc., a lot of the time, to start with, the shift is just being okay with yourself and being okay with yourself as a human being outside of how you look. Because way too much of our society is focused on aesthetics and how someone looks, which should be a very tiny thing. And I know women who are very amazing people in this world who are doing fantastic things, and all they care about is how they look. And we're sold into this idea of beauty and that everyone can be beautiful. And I do agree with that up until a point, but not everyone is going to look like a model. And to believe that is going to happen is totally unrealistic. And so the idea shouldn't be that everyone should be beautiful by society standards. It should be everyone should feel good about themselves within their body because of a whole range of things that they can do, not just because of how they look.
Yeah, it's I have a post that I wrote probably like 3 years ago at this point or something. That was my most popular post ever, and it was probably because I drank half a bottle of wine before I wrote it. But it's called Paleo Women Are Fat, and fat is spelled P-H-A-T, which I don't know if you guys use that term. It's not really a term a lot of people use here, but it's kind of a old school term for being awesome or something. Yeah. But that post was super popular, and I think a lot of it was because, I talked about the fact that our standards, our societal standards of what women should look like does not necessarily align with what a standard of a healthy woman is. So, understanding that for fertility, body fat percentage between, 25 to 28 is identified as the most fertile body fat range. But then obviously you have these photos circulating the internet that say, or I've actually seen, what is it? It's like some fitness organization says that if you're above 30% body fat for a woman, that you're obese. And so, just understanding that our physique goals when it comes to what society suggests is healthy and attractive doesn't necessarily line up with what is actually best for our bodies. And certainly different bodies will be different optimal. So somebody that is 20% body fat, that might be what they maintain with absolutely no effort at all. And then for other people, 20% body fat might take, a huge amount of effort and maybe causes them to lose their menstrual cycle and that kind of stuff. So understanding that your appearance, first of all, is not necessarily a direct correlation with your health. And then second of all, understanding that even if you aren't 100% healthy, or even if you are overweight or underweight or whatever the issue is with your body, that doesn't mean that that's the most important part of your life. And that was a big part of the post as well, was explaining that women have a lot more to offer the world than just what their appearance is. And certainly no one's going to do I don't personally believe that anyone's going to change the world in a positive way by having a perfect body. So, even if somebody is feeling a little bad about their appearance or doesn't feel great about the way they look, I think really focusing on things that they are contributing or could contribute to the world. Because unfortunately, a lot of times when women get wrapped up in their appearance and what they look like, they're spending way too much time doing what needs to be done to look better, as opposed to doing things that are helping other people or contributing something positive to the world. And unfortunately, obviously it's a societal thing that appearance is so highly valued by others. But I think at the end of the day, if people really think about who in their lives are the most important to them and what kind of things that they really value in other humans, it's not what the person looks like. So, just taking a look at other inspirational people in your lives. If you're a woman, maybe thinking of some women that really inspire you and thinking about what they offer the world that is inspirational. I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's not their appearance. So if you can kind of wrap your head around that and then start to think about, what am I really good at? What do I have to offer the world that can help other people? And am I really spending enough time doing the things that not only help others, but make me feel like I'm contributing something valuable? I think that can really help shift the mindset, even if the appearance issue is not really addressed as far as seeing any changes are concerned.
Yeah, I think what you said there is great. In terms of yourself and being in the paleo community, the ancestral community, when I look at what you put on Facebook these days in terms of the way that you eat and the things that you're doing, it really flies in the face of what a lot of that community promotes. And so how does that sit with you? And have you had much in the way of backlash of people saying you say that you're ancestral, but you're doing this or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I think I'm not doing anything excessively contradictory.
You're not, but I know how extreme things can be.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I just wanted to point that out because I think for a lot of bloggers or people that are in my position where they're sharing their own process as far as determining what their optimal diet is or what their optimal lifestyle is. A lot of people in my position can be fearful of sharing things honestly because they don't want backlash about, oh, you said that you're paleo, but you're eating oatmeal or whatever. And, honestly, I feel like most people are a lot less critical of people than what we imagine them to be. I mean, certainly there's a lot of jerks out there that are happy to share their opinion with you if you do anything that's outside of their belief system. But I do think I've cultivated a pretty tolerant and also open-minded community in my work. So I'm glad to see that I'm not getting any super negative responses to my dietary experimentations. And in fact, I think it can be really helpful to other people who, I think a lot of people out there that follow the paleo community or, listen to certain podcasts or follow certain personalities really believe that these people eat a perfect paleo diet. And that's really, really not true. I mean, I spent a weekend with Rob Wolf, for example, a couple weeks ago or a month ago or so. And he was eating foods that we definitely would not consider paleo. And he's like practically the father of the paleo movement or whatever. So, obviously there's certain things that he's not eating like gluten, for example, but he was eating dairy. He was drinking alcohol, that kind of stuff. So I think there's this little misinterpretation when it comes to the people in the paleo community who are kind of the figureheads or the role models that they do perfect paleo and that they never eat anything that's not paleo approved. And certainly there are some people that I believe promote that image more than others, which I don't personally follow those people or feel that they're very inspirational. But I think there is a role for people who are in the health sphere to be transparent and also to show that experimentation and, diverting a little bit from a strict dietary approach is okay and it can actually be helpful. So I think there's a lot of people that follow my work that actually really appreciate that I share that information. And I don't want people to see what I do and say, oh, that means she's saying that everyone should eat this. And there may be stuff that I'm eating right now that in a month or two, I may say, actually, I don't think this is working for me, so I'm going to change it. So understanding that, first of all, nobody that you follow on the internet is perfect. And if they say that they are, you should probably stop following them. And then also understanding that it's okay to listen to your own body and use your own judgment to make changes in your diet that, maybe they don't follow what the general community is saying. I mean, I've posted pictures of kombucha before and people would say, oh my gosh, but there's so much sugar in that. And I'm like, there's like 8 grams of sugar in this. There's not that much sugar. Like, can we please calm down? It's not like I'm drinking like a liter of Coke or something, So it's just, I personally think it's really important to try to dissipate some of the intensity and neuroticism that can come from these dietary communities, I'll call them. I don't want to use the word cults, but, communities where there's this philosophy of nutrition that becomes very black and white. And I like to kind of remind people that there are a wide range of diets that people can do quite well on, and not everybody needs to be grain-free or avoid carbs or even gluten-free. Like, I don't think everyone has to be avoiding gluten. So, I think it can make people feel a lot less stressed about the dietary decisions that they make. And I think it gives them a little bit more of a license to make the decisions that work best for them, regardless of what other people are doing. So luckily there hasn't really been too much negativity. And, it is interesting to see what kind of posts that people get really excited about. But my goal is to just empower people to make the decisions that work best for them without feeling like they're doing something wrong for their bodies because it doesn't align perfectly with something that they've read in a book.
Yeah. And I'm a big one for doing what you said there in terms of I want to be really realistic with people. I want to be very transparent. I don't have the most perfect diet. I eat well, but I also love eating pizza and burgers and drinking and all of that. And I think people need to have realistic expectations about what a healthy diet really looks like. Mm-hmm. And as you said, so much of it has become neurotic and has become over the top, and that within itself is unhealthy and causes just as many problems as the pizza that someone has actually eaten.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, honestly, that kind of just brings us full circle to this whole adrenal fatigue issue. Is you get people that are essentially phobic of foods that honestly are probably not going to do anything to them from a biochemical standpoint, but because they're so afraid of them, or, certainly there'll be people that eat foods because, they feel pressured to, or because they love the food and they just quote unquote fall off the wagon, as they say. But then, after they've eaten the food, they start having these horrible thoughts about, oh my gosh, I've just eaten this terrible thing and now my gut's going to get all messed up, or I'm going to gain weight. And it's like those negative thoughts that come from food fears that are unreasonable or unnecessary ends up doing more harm than just eating the food in the first place. So now I'm not saying that there aren't people that, like, for example, gluten intolerance or celiac disease. I certainly don't want those people to just say, whatever, screw it, I'm going to eat gluten because I don't want to have any sort of dietary restrictions. So there's a fine line between an appropriate dietary restriction that is helping someone feel better versus something that they're just doing because, person X said that that's the way you should eat for abs or for perfect health. So it's one of those things that people really need to be very conscious about what works for them. And certainly working with someone that can do either, dietary analysis or testing or whatever is necessary to identify what the best thing to do is can be really helpful. But ultimately, the best person to figure that stuff out for the long run is the person that's experiencing the health. So, if you find that there's a food that's bothering you, it doesn't matter if it came up clean on a food test. You shouldn't eat it if it makes you feel bad. And then vice versa, if, there's foods out there that people say don't eat because it's bad for you, but you really enjoy it and every time you've eaten it, you don't see any issues at all, then maybe that's something that's fine for you to eat. So, I think people need to be okay with letting themselves direct their decision making and not letting all the other influences make them make decisions that they're not comfortable with or aren't really helpful for them.
Yeah. And even when I'm working with someone, I always say, like, you have to be an active participant in this. I know research, mm-hmm. I know what's worked with past clients, I know what vitamins and minerals are in certain foods, but all of that stuff is not very important once I'm then working with a real live human being. Mm-hmm. And what works for you, you need to give me the feedback on it.
Definitely.
And so if people can take that mentality, it's much better, as opposed to what most people do is they want to pass the buck. They want to follow some diet where they don't have to think. And that rarely works. You might be the one in a million person who stumbles upon the right diet that is absolutely perfect for you, but it's absolutely rare.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's been really great chatting with you. Where can someone come and find out more about your stuff? You said you've got a program, so do you want to tell people about that program?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the main website that I share my work through is called Ancestralize Me. Now, I'm considering doing some rebranding, so that's the current website. And certainly if I end up doing any rebranding, it'll just redirect people to the new website if I create one anytime soon. But right now you can find me at ancestralizeme.com. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff. I'm occasionally on Periscope. I'm trying to get over my fear of live conversations on the video. But the program that we've created is called Paleo Rehab. And again, that's kind of a double entendre where some people do benefit from a slightly more specific whole foods diet. So maybe the paleo-ish approach is going to help them feel better because they've removed offending foods. On the flip side, the bulk of our clients that come through that program are people who have gone way too far into the paleo rabbit hole and have actually caused more harm than good following a super restrictive diet. So we help them get out of that restrictive mentality while still identifying the diet that makes them feel the best. So, maybe gluten isn't going to work for you, but maybe dairy will, or something like that, where that person can start to expand their diet in a way that supports their health and also allows them to have less restrictions in general. And so that program, again, like I said earlier, we do offer testing if that's something the person wants to do. It's not required. We also offer optional supplements that if somebody wants to do the test and wants to take some of those adaptogens or herbs that match their cortisol profile, we do give them the information that they need if that's something they want to do. But the bulk of the program is focused on, again, diet, making sure that people are eating enough food and getting good macronutrient balance, not overeating on fat or undereating carbs or not eating enough in general. We have a big section on lifestyle that includes a lot of stuff about exercise modifications and sleep hygiene and circadian rhythm entrainment and all that good stuff that I think is just as important as the diet, if not possibly more important for a lot of people.
Yeah,
and then we have a module on orthorexia. And if people aren't familiar with that term, it's basically an eating disorder that is really based on the obsession with healthy eating. So I see that in a lot of my clients, and we want to help people learn how to eat in a way that's healthy and supportive of their best health without it turning into an obsession or, like I said, a disordered pattern. So we have a big section on how to identify if orthorexia is an issue for you, tips on how to improve your body image, and, talking about some of that stuff with weight gain, since a lot of our clients that go through the program do gain a little bit of weight because they're eating more and exercising less. And, in the short term, in 5 weeks, of course, gaining a few pounds after making those changes is totally normal. So we like to try to address the mindset stuff that comes along with that little bit of weight gain that can happen. So I'm super proud of the program. I think it's been really helpful for a lot of people. We've gotten a lot of great results, lots of great feedback about people who feel that the program really helped make them understand why they were feeling the way that they were feeling and to help them make actually effective changes to start feeling better. We even had a client say that she felt like our program literally saved her life, which I was like, I don't know how we did that, but thank you for telling me that. That's crazy. So, it's one of those things that just in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of criticism of me and the program and my, writings about adrenal fatigue. And, not that I care. It's, one of those things that you come to expect when you start to become a little bit more, I don't want to say popular, but, if people are seeing my work, there's guaranteed to be people that disagree with it. So, there was a period of time that I was feeling frustrated and not sure why there was so many of these critics that were so negative about the stuff that we were doing, but then I realized that they don't actually understand what's inside the program. And I'm really happy with the product that we've created, and I feel that there's a lot of benefits that our students have gotten. Now, one thing I want to mention is that we will be changing our enrollment strategy for the program in the next month or so. This is the end of September that we're recording. So if you're hearing this in October, you might want to get the program soon, because we're going to be closing it for enrollment at the end of October and then maybe opening it next spring again. So just wanted to let people know, just so they don't go to our website and see that the program's not accepting new students at the moment.
Okay, great. And look, what you just said there in terms of getting negative feedback and people not really understanding it, the article that I read that you wrote that I'll link to in the show notes, I think does a really good job of explaining all of that. And I can see why, because of my own beliefs around the term adrenal fatigue and how it's used. In that article, you addressed all of that. And I think it's a really good article that explains exactly what the program's about and what you guys are trying to achieve.
Yeah, unfortunately, I would prefer not to use the term adrenal fatigue, but part of that article includes a Google Trends analysis of the term adrenal fatigue compared to HPA axis dysregulation, or I think even just HPA axis. And the difference in search terms for that is so incredible that if we had called the program HPA axis, healing or whatever you want to call it, I don't think we would have sold any program. Yeah. So, ultimately at the end of the day, I don't love the term adrenal fatigue, but we're using it because if it helps find the people who are looking for this information, then, I compare it to the term heartburn. Obviously, if you have reflux, you're not actually having a burning heart. So calling it heartburn is not medically accurate, and you wouldn't be diagnosed with heartburn as a specific diagnosis. But if I created a program that says heal your heartburn, nobody would say that's BS. You're making up a condition that doesn't exist. So that's kind of like what my opinion is about it. So just wanted to clarify that so people don't think I'm being self-contradictory.
Sure. No, that's great. And look, Laura, it's been wonderful having you on the show today. You have just provided some really good information on what HbA access dysregulation is, what adrenal fatigue is, all of that. So thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.